Okay. Well, thanks very much, Sergio, for that introduction and the invitation to speak. Those of you who know me know I like my rock music, so I thought I'd intrigue you all with this retro Iron Maiden t-shirt. Apparently, Sergio used to listen in the 90s. I'd say he's still 30 years out of date by not still listening now, but there we are. So what Sergio's asked us to do is to look at this idea of what is decision making. So in terms of both myself and Mike, I said I would look at it in terms of coaching as decision making, and then Mike's going to start looking at it from what decision making might look like for players. So I suppose my opening gambit from this would be that this is a very famous saying. It's I think, therefore I am. It's meant to suggest that one of the things which defines humanity and about who we are is our capacity to think, and that the fact is that we can think means that yes, we exist and therefore we are doing things. And things that get done, one of those things is coaching, and I suppose it's no different from any other thing that humans engage in. And I suppose the opening point here is that in order to engage in coaching, you have to think. So I suppose there's the opening statement about why it's useful for us to look at decision making or coaching as decision making, because it just requires us to think. We might want to think about what it is that we want to actually think about. So this was a part of the work that went into the international degree standards that Sergio referred to. And it was trying to look at how do primary functions align with skills and align with knowledge. Now, I'm not expecting us to look at all of this for the moment. If you're interested in this, please go on both the paper and the overall document are both freely available online. I'm sure we can link to those later on. The thing I'd like us to look at, if my computer will work, is just this idea of primary function. So this was work that actually Sergio led on with some others to look at, if we were to look at coaching, what are the main things that coaches do? So this talks about setting relevant visions, strategies, creating a good environment, conducting practices, reflecting on performance and engaging in lifelong learning, building positive relationships, and then that last one, which talks about making informed decisions. Now, I would argue that the first 5 of those are reliant on us being able to make informed decisions. And therefore, that, as I keep coming back to, this is why I think it's really helpful for us to consider coaching through that lens in terms of, sorry, I'm just making sure I don't go over time. In terms of trying to work out, well, how do people achieve these primary functions? So there are skills and there are knowledge bases, and I'll come back to knowledge bases in a short while. But it's, if you like, that provides the context against which we can look at decision making for coaches. So coaches need to make decisions in order to achieve those primary functions. If we look at decision making from a relatively simplistic point of view, we might think it'll start with perception. So perception of information. And that perception of information may come through the eyes, it may come through the ears, and it may take the form of watching someone do something, reading something, hearing someone talk. So as you're listening to this and viewing the screen, you're perceiving information through your audio and visual mechanisms. Now, kinesthetic is also another form of perception. Through that perception, we are able to start forming some judgments, and through those judgments, we're able to then start making some decisions. And those decisions then translate into behaviors. So if we take a relatively simple example of, I observe someone kicking the ball, and through that perception, I start to form a judgment that perhaps there is something technically not quite right. So as a result of that, I create a decision to go, right, I need to intervene and perhaps give some feedback to this participant. That feedback then forms a behavior. Now that sounds very mechanistic, and there is a lot more to this, but I'm just trying to offer a relatively simple view of this. But the other simple view is worth considering is sometimes we might also want to think about intuition. And intuition, if you read about that, often talks about it as being relatively unconscious. So therefore, the judgment decision element of it might not always be particularly conscious. So intuition is often referred to as being this idea of perception to judgment or to perception action coupling, but as it's referred to in the dynamical systems literature. So intuition does exist, and we'll perhaps talk about that a little bit later on. So we have that behavior, and then that behavior creates some sort of consequence. The consequence might be in the example I've just talked about, is that person we're giving feedback to starts to change something. And as a result of that change, we might then go back through a perception, judgment, decision, behavior situation again. Now, I think this is one of the reasons why it's useful to look at, is if we look at the way in which coach development has worked a lot over the past 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of talk around competency. And competency typically focuses on looking at the coach behavior, looking at the decision, at the consequence of that behavior, and forming a judgment about whether or not that coach is competent enough, competent or not. Hopefully, as you look at this, you start to acknowledge that, or see that the problem with that is it doesn't necessarily think about or consider the decision which led to that behavior in the first place. So when I've presented this to a good friend now who works for the Football Association, one of the things he talks about is when he started to get into this was he tries not to talk too much to coaches during a session that they deliver, because he's saying by the time they're delivering the session, most of the judgments and decisions have been made prior to that during the planning process. So what he now talks about is actually he's really interested in the planning process to see how that influences what goes on in front of him on the pitch somewhere. So it's one of the reasons why we might question this idea of competency. If we look at this more broadly, therefore, that there isn't just a single decision, there are numerous decisions, and as those continually work on each other in order to achieve consequences which are reflected on and so on. So it becomes almost like a circular process. And if we're looking at this from a research perspective, we might argue as people start to make more and more of those judgments, they're able to start displaying what we perhaps better call professional competence. So they are able to do things like, it's always saying, how would you engage with people to form a strong relationship? Because strong relationships is seen as being a really important professional competence, is your capacity to form those relationships. There is a judgment and decision-making process which goes behind that. So the more we get into that, the more we're able to start moving towards that process. What I've tried to do in this slide is perhaps bring this back to, well, what does this mean for us if we're looking at coaching? So if we look at that top line there, it talks about the common perception of coaching might be plan, deliver, review. Now I've separated plan and review away from deliver, and that's a deliberate reason why I've done that. And that comes from, if we look at the next line down, which talks about this idea of decision-making as being dual processed. And this is the work from Daniel Kahneman, which is very much worthwhile engaging with. That the book that he wrote is really accessible. And what he talks about is, broadly speaking, that humans operate on either a type 1 or type 2 decision-making process. Type 1 he will class as being fast and intuitive. Type 2 he will class as being slow and deliberative. So you perhaps can see why I perhaps align the slow and deliberative with the planning and reviewing element of coaching, and the fast and intuitive with the things that we might have to do when we're delivering in order to perhaps keep up with things that are going on in front of us, to make a fast consideration about what we're seeing in order to offer some feedback. One of the things which I think is really important for us to consider is, how do these two processes and mechanisms talk to each other? Which, if you go back to what I was saying before about the coach educator, he talked about how he's very interested in understanding the planning processes to see how they filter through to the delivery processes. So he's trying to see how coaches are connecting their type 2 decision-making with their type 1 decision-making. One of the things we can also do with this is consider, how long has it taken us to plan? Because if a plan is only being put together in, say, half an hour, the likelihood is it's not being particularly deliberative. And that might be because of constraints. Is that, I coach, and sometimes I only have 1 or 2 hours to perhaps start thinking about what it is I want to go and do with a group of players, because it's a voluntary process. But it's a worthwhile reflection to think, what would this look like if I put more time and effort to it? And I think this is where the next line down, it becomes helpful. This is work from Yates and Shearhart, who split decision-making up actually into 3 areas. The first one they talk about as being analytic. the second one being rule-based, the third one being intuitive or automatic. And I think this is really helpful because I think it perhaps provides that middle ground. So it may well be that when I'm trying to think about what I'm trying to do with athletes, I become really, really analytic and start to try and collect as much data as I can in order to create a really slow and informed judgment so that I can be really confident in that judgment. He would then talk about how sometimes we don't perhaps have that time, we're not afforded that time, we need to get on with things quicker, but we still need to have some sense of that, having to think about what we're doing. So he would talk about, or sorry, these guys would talk about rule-based thinking. So it may well be, if I'm planning a session, that is, I want to get the kids interested, I want to get the kids involved, and I want to keep them busy because it's cold and wet and whatever. So those are rules that I might follow in order to start thinking about the sorts of games that I might pull together that I want the people to engage with. So it's an okay process. And finally, he talks about, again, fitting with perhaps what Kahneman talks about, which is we might just have intuitive decision making, which might be that we see something and we react to it something very quickly. And the suggestion is we're more likely to do that when we're emotional. So that might be, again, worthwhile considering as behaviors, touchline behaviors, about how emotions might perhaps start to impact on those. Final line, I've just put in there because, again, it's a very common phrase which is used within coaching, which is reflective practice. If we look at the work of Sean, he talks about reflection on and reflection for practice. And again, if you look at reflection on, we might think about reviewing what we've been doing. A reflection for practice, we might align with that planning process. How do those two things talk to each other? But he also talks about our capacity to reflect in action. So it may be that whilst we're delivering, we're seeing things that we might want to think about. And that might be very intuitive, or it might be, I've got certain rules that I follow and I'm trying to consider what I'm trying to do. And reflection and action, Sean talks about our capacity to experiment in the moment. We're not quite sure if our judgment will achieve what we think it will. So I need to actually have a go. And if it doesn't, then I'll have a go at something else. And if it doesn't, I'll have a go at something else. So he refers to that reflection in action as being about experimenting. But again, where do those experiments come from? And they generally come from the rules that we go into that session with. So if I'm going to examine someone's passing, I might have some certain rules that I've decided these are the important things that I'm going to look for. And I've got some certain ideas about how I might ask the players to change something, but I don't know for certain that those things will happen. So each time I do that, it's a bit of an experiment, and I then get into a reflection action to see whether the experiment's working. So overall, I think that's me trying to offer a view about how that judgment and decision making works. I'm just going to finish with this idea of, well, what is it we're drawing on? And what Yates and Shearhart talk about is the idea of, are we drawing on formal theory or folk theory? They don't necessarily say one's better than the other, although you might look at these list of ideas and suggest that they are, but there's a recognition that not everything can be always formal and not everything should always be folk. So I think they offer this more in terms of again, as a reflection tool, rather than to say one good, one is bad. That's too dualistic, or too black and white. We have to recognize that we're not always in control over the theories that we use. But if we look at formal theory, we might consider the sorts of things that we read, that we believe are valid or reliable, that we then bring into ourselves, so it becomes our theory, not someone else's theory. So those theories are ours, they're critically tested by others, but also critically tested by us. On the other hand, we might see folk theory, these sorts of things which are handed down generation to generation. They might not always be particularly critically tested. They may not always have a whole lot of underpinning rationale. So they might be more rule-based rather than rationale-based. They can lack validity, they can lack reliability, and perhaps one that might be a little bit more a controversial idea is that they might actually restrict creativity, because what we know from creativity is the more we understand why things are the way they are, the more likely we are to see coincidences and contradictions, and those are the sorts of things which tend to generate us being a bit more, why has that happened? So we get into that reflective surprise process, which then might start to drive our creativity. If we don't have all that depth of understanding, we might miss those moments and therefore miss the opportunity to see things in a different way. But there's also the final one, which is we don't do it like that here, which again is a typical folk theory sort of idea.